Welcome everyone to this first webinar in the 2018 Meerkat webinar series, and thanks for joining us. My name is Phil Cohen and I'm the moderator for today's session. For those of you who don't know me, I'm a social researcher by training and have more than 25 years of experience in both the government and non-government sectors. I now undertake a range of activities including research, evaluation, project management, stakeholder engagement and relationship management for clients in the public, private and not-for-profit sectors. And I'm very pleased to introduce my colleague, Dr. Donna Cohen, who will be presenting today's webinar. Donna had a distinguished 15-year career in biomedical research before embarking on a whole new career trajectory about 20 years ago. Since then, she has worked in science communication, developed and implemented public policy in biotechnology, and established a number of teaching and research initiatives in the Faculty of Medicine, Nursing and Health Science at Monash University here in Melbourne. For the last 10 years, she's run her own consultancy business and in that capacity has been a major contributor to initiatives aimed at improving and expanding the clinical education and training capacity of Victorian health services. She has also developed an extensive practice in evaluation, quality improvement and strategic planning, particularly in the public and not-for-profit sectors. Okay, so moving on, basically in thinking about how people use logic models, generally they sort of fall into two camps. Those that use tabulated logic models, which are shown on the left of the slide, and those that use graphical logical models based on flow diagram or process mapping concepts. Both formats have numerous variations, but for clarity, tabulated logic models are generally in one of the formats shown, as I said, on the left of the slide, while graphical logical models are like that shown on the right of the slide. In tabulated models, there is an implicit understanding that inputs feed into activities or processes, which give rise to outputs and so on. Sometimes the model developer will include an arrow between the segments, as shown on the bottom here, but the arrow is not particularly informative because it doesn't show direct relationships. In graphical models, arrows are used to show direct relationships. So for example, this input is used in this process to give rise to this output and so on. So with that as a starting point, I'm now going to move over to the left here and hand over to Donna, who will deliver the body of the presentation. To you, Donna.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Phil, and hello, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us today. I'll just get myself set up here. So as Phil mentioned earlier, I'm going to be talking about the approach that we have developed that allows us to get considerably more value from our program logic models. By way of introduction, I thought I would begin by telling you about how and why it is that I started using graphical logic models in the first place, and really what it is that led me to look for ways to extract more value from those models we had developed. And some of the issues that we confronted might be things that you've also confronted in your work. I'm then going to show you the solution that we developed to deal with those issues and demonstrate a range of ways in which that solution can be applied. So as Phil mentioned earlier in his introduction, during the mid-2000s, I was working as the director of a strategic projects unit at Monash University. And my team and I were responsible for designing and implementing a number of teaching and research initiatives for the faculty. We had to develop business cases to obtain funding from both internal and external sources. And we also needed implementation roadmaps that would assist us to project manage the rollout of the various initiatives. Now, at that time, there was no particular focus on evaluation of those initiatives. So the emphasis was mostly on project design and implementation. Now, while logic modeling has been around for, I think, about 30 years, I do have to admit that 12 years ago, I was not particularly aware of it as an established technique. But, you know, mapping out the inputs and the activities through which the desired outputs and outcomes would be achieved seemed like a reasonable approach to project management, and so that's what we did. And because we needed fairly explicit roadmap of how everything should fit together, we drew graphical maps, not tabulated maps, and we used arrowed lines to help show the direct relationships between the various nodes in the map. So this approach worked very well for us as the program designers, both to design the actual program and also to make the necessary business cases. But it also worked very well for us as implementation managers to keep the project funders and project champions informed about what we were doing. Indeed, one of the reasons that I really like graphical logic models is that they are very useful as communication tools. You know, when you include such a model in a business case or in a presentation to your colleagues, your audience really understands what you're talking about. It's very easy for them to follow the steps of the process, and the use of an image helps to avoid any ambiguity or misalignment of perceptions and understandings. Another thing that I really like is that the graphical models force you, as the model developer or the program designer, to really think about the assumptions that you're making about how your program or project or system is going to work. Because, you know, if I draw a line connecting two nodes in the map, implicit in that line is an assumption about the relationship between those two components of the system. Now, I'm aware that there are those out there some people out there in this community of interest that will argue that graphical logic models have quite limited value because A, they don't represent reality, they represent intent, and B, because they create an impression of simple linear relationships in systems that are actually quite complex. Now, without wanting to get sidetracked down this particular line of argument, I don't think that these are actually reasons not to use graphical models. Provided that we take these caveats into account in our use of the model, I believe that graphical models actually add considerable value. I think it's better to develop an imperfect understanding of how systems work and then test and improve that understanding, rather than treating the system like an unknowable black box, which is the problem that I have with many of the tabulated logic models that I've come across over the years. In fact, I really like this Sidney Harris cartoon, which captures the issue quite beautifully. He's saying here, I think you should be more explicit here in step number 2. I think that's really quite lovely. So indeed, this need to look inside the black box actually brings me to the final reason why it is that I really like graphical logic models, which is because of their usefulness in developing evaluation frameworks. Over the last 10 years, we've developed and implemented quite a number of evaluation frameworks. And we know from experience that it's actually very difficult to identify appropriate structural and process indicators for a program or system if you don't explicitly define the intended relationships between the inputs, activities, outputs, and outcomes. You know, you really can't have a black box in the middle of your logic model if you want to design and conduct a process evaluation. The bottom line is that while I have no doubt there are situations when a tabulated logic model is all that is needed, in the work that we've been doing as program implementation managers and program evaluators, we found that graphical logic models better suit the requirements. Now, in terms of drawing our graphical logic models, in the early days, we used programs like Visio and also its Mac counterpart, OmniGraffle, or we used PowerPoint. You can also draw shapes in both Word and Excel, but while Excel is quite useful for this purpose, Word most definitely is not. Then some years ago, DoView came onto the scene and we moved across to using that software. And I know that a lot of people continue to use that today. And of course, now there are quite a number of online tools that you can use to draw process maps or logic models. Just Google process mapping software and there's quite a selection out there to choose from. And at this point, I'd actually be quite interested to know whether you use tabulated logic models or graphical logic models in your work, or perhaps you sometimes use one or sometimes the other. So Phil's going to put a poll up on the screen now, and I'm interested if you could answer the question of which type of logic model you currently use. Perhaps you only use tabulated logic models, maybe you only use graphical models, perhaps you sometimes use one, sometimes the other. Okay, so we're getting good response rate there. Thank you for responding so quickly to the polls, by the way, that's very helpful. Okay, so it looks like a bit of a split. About half of you only use the graphical logic models, and about a quarter sometimes use one, sometimes the other, and some use only tabulated logic models. Okay, thanks very much for that, Phil. I'll just relaunch these slides. Anyway, the one thing that all...
Sorry, Don, just someone's asked a question whether your slides will be available post-webinar. And
yes, they will, yes. And the other thing I should just mention is that we're recording this webinar, and so we will have a recording of this. So if you just have to go back and have another look at it, it will be up there on the website for you to have another look at, or you can share that with your colleagues at the end. Yeah, thanks very much for that question. The one thing that all of these map drawing tools that are listed here, the one thing that they all have in common is that the logic map that is created is effectively a static map. By that I mean that the map is just there on the page or the screen. You can edit it, of course, and you can print it, but you can't actually do anything with it aside from look at it and refer to it. Now, for many people, and perhaps for many of the uses of logic models, just being able to print the map and look at it or put it into your business case or whatever, maybe that's all that you needed. And indeed, I have to admit that in my early days of developing logic models, I tended not to use the models on an ongoing basis once they'd been created. But you know, most of the reason for that was because the things that I might have done with my logic models were not really doable with the static logic models that I was drawing. So for example, the tools that I needed for program implementation needed a more dynamic tracking process than could be achieved with a static logic map. And the use of the logic model in a program evaluation context pretty much ended when we'd identified our evaluation questions and our indicators, because there was no way to actually use the logic model as a data collection tool in the context of the evaluation itself. But you know, given the amount of IP and effort that we put into developing those logic models, it always seemed like a bit of a waste of a very valuable resource. And this really came home to us in two very specific contexts. So the first of these was the implementation of a quality improvement framework across public hospitals in the state of Victoria. And that framework was called the Best Practice Clinical Learning Environment, or Bpcle Framework, a little bit of a mouthful. We needed a way for hospitals to be able to assess their current arrangements against the ideals that are set out in the framework, in the 6 elements of the framework that are shown here on this slide. Now, we had already created logic models for each of those 6 elements, and we thought it would be quite useful if the logic models could be used in some way by the hospitals to provide structure to that assessment process. Now, the second context was a program evaluation project where the client had requested both a formative and a summative evaluation of the project over a 3-year period. Now, that program was called the Rural Community Intern Training, or RCIT program, and that's being conducted at 5 sites across Victoria. Now, what's showing here on the slide is the logic model for that. I'm quite certain you will not be able to distinguish the detail of this map looking at it there on the slide on the screen, but what I can show you is the logic map goes from left to right with the inputs over here. Those are the yellow-edged boxes, working through processes and intermediate outcomes in the center of the map. They have blue and purple edges, and coming across to the longer term outcomes and ultimately to the objectives shown here in green on the right hand side. As I say, the detail is not particularly important. The other thing that you can see here shown in red writing, red text, are the indicators that we had identified. And you can see just by looking at this, even without being able to see the detail, you can see that we had no difficulty in identifying outcome indicators, but we had considerably more difficulty in identifying suitable structural and process indicators. Now, this is not uncommon in my experience, and it reminds me of the old adage that not everything that is important about a program or system can be measured by an indicator, and similarly, not everything that can be measured by an indicator is necessarily all that important. So as with the Bpcle framework project I mentioned a moment ago, here again, we had a situation where we had a perfectly good logic model with lots of useful information built into the model about how program implementation was expected to occur, but we had no way to tap into the logic model as an evaluation tool. In both cases, what we wanted to do, our solution, was to convert our static logic model into an interactive data collection tool. So the idea was that once you had created the logic model, you would switch over to a different mode of using that logic model, whereby if you clicked on a node in the map, that this would then open a dialog box. And the dialog box would include a rating question and a rating scale specific to that question for that node. And then depending on the rating that was nominated by the group who were doing this rating, this would then be depicted differently on the map. So for example, if you had an above average rating, this would get a tick mark, whereas an average rating or a below average rating would give you some type of hazard mark. And of course, when all of the nodes in the map have been rated, as we see in this slide, you then would have this sort of instant snapshot of where program implementation had worked well and where problems or issues had been identified. Anyway, that was the concept, which we called Map-Enabled Experiential Review, or MER. And as I said a moment ago, this allowed us to tap into the wealth of value stored within our logic model, not just to help us to identify evaluation questions and indicators, but also to collect information about those aspects of programs that are essential for successful implementation, but which don't lend themselves to being evaluated or reviewed through indicator measurement. Anyway, we went ahead and piloted this MER approach in the Bpcle Framework implementation project. We were using interactive logic models that we actually built in Excel. And we got such a good response from stakeholders who use those Excel prototypes that we created an online version, which is called Bpcle Tool, and that's now in use right across Victoria. We also created a version of this MER tool that can be used for any program or system context, and this tool is called Meerkat. Now, Meerkat has its own drawing tool, which is called the Basemap Builder. And you can draw your logic model in the Basemap Builder in pretty much the same ways you can draw a logic model in any of the other online tools that I mentioned earlier. So you can create as many nodes as you want, you can position them wherever you want to on the canvas, and you can make your canvas as large as you want it to be. And then you can connect your nodes with straight lines or with lines that have as many pivot points in them as you want. Meerkat does not care whether you draw your map top to bottom, bottom to top, or left to right, and you're even able to add swim lanes if you want to. So at the end of the map drawing exercise, you have a map that you can print out and hang on your wall if that's what you want to do. You can include it in your project plan or whatever it is that you usually do with your logic models. But what makes the Meerkat Basemap Builder unique compared to all those other tools is that you are building a tool that can also be used as an interactive tool in the context of monitoring and evaluation. So as well as positioning all of the nodes on the map, you also add content to each node that will then be used in whatever implementation, evaluation, or quality improvement context in which you plan to use your logic model. And I'm going to come back later in this presentation to show you the kinds of applications that you can use an interactive model in. But first, I want to show you how to add the interactive content to the map, because that will help you to understand what you can actually do with this format for your logic models. So what I'm showing you now is a Basemap builder view, and you can tell that it is because you might just be able to discern that there are grid dots here in the map. So when you click on a node in the Basemap builder, what happens is it opens up a node content panel. So here you give your node a title, which is the title that appears on the node in the map. You add some descriptive information and you assign a node type. Now the tool has 6 pre-assigned node types and there are 4 more that you can customize. The node description section allows you to include information about this aspect of the program or system that is particularly relevant or important to the successful implementation of the program or system. So in this way, your logic model becomes a repository of information about the program or system that the model represents. We also use this section to nominate the node rating question. And down here is where you nominate the rating scale that goes with that question. You're able to create a scale that goes anywhere between 2 and 5 rating options, and you can make every node's rating question and rating scale unique to that node. Now further down is a section that you can choose to use if you want to, depending once again on the context in which you plan to use your logic model. These are suggested tasks for inclusion in a quality improvement action plan. So if a problem or issue is identified with this node in the course of an evaluation or an assessment session, you've already effectively pre-populated with some suggested action plan tasks. Now, once you've created your logic model with all of its node content, we call this a Basemap, you publish it within the Meerkat application. And that then allows it to be used as an interactive data collection tool, which you do using the assessment functionality of Meerkat. So I'm now going to show you this same section of this Basemap, but this is now in assessment mode. And you can see that the map looks very similar to what you saw in the previous slide, except that there's no grid shown here. So now, as you saw in the case of the Basemap builder, the node title is displayed in the node and the node type is shown as a color-coded edge, as you saw in the Basemap builder. But here in assessment mode, when you click on the node, its data entry dialog box opens up. So here is the node description information I showed you a moment ago that you entered when you were building the Basemap, and here is oops, sorry, let's go back here. Anyway, somewhere there we go. And here is the rating scale that was nominated for that node. So from what I've shown you thus far, you're probably already getting some idea of how you might be able to use this approach and extend the usefulness of your logic model. Before I show you some of the possibilities that this approach presents, I want to take a quick look at how you use an interactive logic model as a data collection tool. Now, when we were developing this tool, we envisaged that users would probably find the MER approach most beneficial in the context of a group discussion. And depending on the size of your group and the size of your computer screen, a group could either sit or stand around a computer, or as shown here in this slide, you could use a data projector to project the image onto a wall or screen. From our own experience in using this approach, we have one member of the group acting as facilitator, but this role can be rotated amongst participants because the tool is actually very easy to use. For each node in turn, the facilitator would click on the node to open its dialog box, read out perhaps the node description and the rating question, and then group members are asked for their view on the most appropriate rating based on their own experience of that aspect of the system. Now, the number of individuals that nominate each rating option can be recorded in this node rating card because the interface is clickable. And so the facilitator can just click on the appropriate rating nominated by an individual to increase this tally over here. Discussion drawing on the knowledge and the experience of the individuals who are involved in the rating, that is encouraged. And in fact, I have to say that is the whole point of the exercise. And any comments that are made by group members can be recorded by the facilitator up here in the comments area, and you're also able to attach documents. Now, once the discussion for the given node has been completed, then the facilitator would click on the next button to take you into the consensus rating screen. And this is where the group would make a decision on their overall rating. Based on what they've talked about and all the individual ratings for this node, what's the consensus rating? And once they have done that, the facilitator would click on the next button again to take them to the final screen, where they consider whether or not they want to include this particular node in their quality improvement action plan. Now, the tool does make a suggestion, which is based on the polled ratings of the team and the consensus rating, but the group is able to override that if they want to. If they do decide to add it into the action plan, they can go across directly into the linked action planning tool to record actions or tasks that should be added into the action plan to address any issues that were identified for that node. Now, if you use the suggested action plan section when you were setting up the node in the Basemap builder, then any tasks that you included are actually shown here. And the group can decide to choose those to include them in their action plan or not. And they can also add other tasks down here based on anything that was discussed in the course of their assessment. So when the node is closed and we return to the map view, you can see that icon appears in the top right-hand corner of the node, reflecting the consensus rating that was given by the group. So depending on the number of nodes in your logic model, the length of the discussion sessions that you're conducting, and the amount of time that you spend discussing individual nodes, a group may take several sessions to rate an entire map. However, the idea is not simply to get through the map rating as quickly as possible, since it is the discussion aspect of the approach that is central to its usefulness. So as groups are working through each node in the map, considering the question they're being asked to rate, people are reflecting on their knowledge and their experience of that particular aspect of the program or system. In our experience, even though the rating question is specific, it does serve the role of being a conversation starter, and the discussion is often quite wide-ranging. And as a result, this reflection and discussion draws out aspects of program implementation that often don't get picked up in evaluation activities that ask for specific data in relation to specific indicators. So using the logic model in this way thereby enables a more holistic picture to be developed in the course of the evaluation. So now I'd like to show you some of the different ways that you can use an interactive logic model. So I'm going to show you 5 different things that you can do, namely program evaluation, comparing program implementation across different sites, assessing the readiness of a site to implement a particular program, tracking program implementation in real time, and finally creating a repository of program implementation information. So the first and the most obvious application, of course, is program evaluation. As well as collecting data against your indicators, you're using your interactive logic model to facilitate structured conversations with stakeholders about their experiences of the program that's being evaluated. Using the logic model to provide the structure for the conversation ensures that you talk about all aspects of program implementation, including those things that may not be readily visible or obvious to all stakeholders. You can either get all of your stakeholders in the room together to work through the map, which is quite a useful thing to do in terms of sharing information between stakeholders, or you can chunk the map into groups of nodes that are relevant to particular groups of stakeholders and work with each group separately. Now, we've used both approaches, and both of them have their advantages. To a large extent, the approach that you take will depend on how easy you're going to find it to get all of your stakeholders in the same room at the same time. So, for example, for the RCIT evaluation that I mentioned earlier in this presentation, we identified 3 major groups of stakeholders, and we knew that we would not be able to get all of them in the room at the same time. And so we met separately with each of those 3 different stakeholder groups. There was also overlapping interest in the various nodes in the map, and so we thought that some stakeholders might not want to sit around for a discussion about nodes that they would have nothing to contribute to. So we met with each stakeholder group separately and compiled a completed assessment based on all those discussions. Now, incidentally, the RCIT evaluation showcased a major benefit of combining this map-based assessment exercise with the more traditional indicator measurement exercise. So just going back to the RCIT logic model, you can see that this section of the map that has the blue dotted line around it, that deals with the recruitment, retention and support of individuals that are key to the success of the program, specifically the supervisors, the medical educators, and the mentors of the rurally based interns. Now, interestingly, we also had a number of structural indicators that were aligned with this part of the map, specifically indicators number 4, 5, and 6. And these measured respectively the retention rates for each of these 3 groups of stakeholders. Now, the indicator results were all very positive. There was virtually 100% retention in all 3 of the categories. However, I think you might just be able to see in the mirror assessment that many of these nodes actually rated that there was a problem, that there was an issue. And mostly the issues were to do with the training and support for these groups of stakeholders. Now, since the evaluation was conducted relatively early in the life of the program, those issues were not yet being reflected in the retention rates of those individuals. And that's why we didn't see any problem with the indicator result. But you know, if the training and support issues are not actually dealt with, then in 2 or 3 years' time, the retention rate indicators might not be returning such a positive result. But by that time, of course, it's too late to avoid the problem. So using the combination of indicator measurement and mirror assessment using our program logic map allowed us to identify issues in the course of the evaluation that would have slipped below the radar if we had relied on indicator measurement alone. This is particularly important if you are undertaking both a formative and a summative evaluation of a program, because the whole point of the formative evaluation is to identify aspects of program implementation that need to be improved to ensure the sustainability and success of the program in the long run. Anyway, so that is the first way that you can use your interactive logic model as an evaluation tool. The second way is a variation on this, whereby you use your interactive logic model to compare the implementation that is occurring across multiple sites implementing the same program. So to do this, you would use the same base map as the starting point and set up a separate assessment activity at each of the sites of your program. The Meerkat application allows you to run reports comparing the assessment results at each site. And you're just looking at a segment of a report here. So this is node by node, and there were 5 program sites. Each one has a little circle with its letter representing that program site, and you can see the consensus ratings that were given by each of the 5 program sites for each of these nodes. So in this way, what you're able to do is to identify issues that are systemic or common between program sites and distinguish those from local issues that might require local solutions. Now, the third and the fourth applications for your interactive logic model are actually at the other end of program rollout, specifically to assess the readiness of a site to implement a program and then to track program implementation in real time. Now, one of the really great things about the Basemap Builder functionality in Meerkat is that you can draw a base map with all of its nodes put into their positions, and then you can clone the map as many times as you like and create different versions that use different rating questions and rating scales. So, for example, you could have one version that has rating scales appropriate for retrospective evaluation, another version with rating scales appropriate for assessing the readiness to implement a program, and yet another version with rating scales appropriate for tracking implementation in real time. So let's look at the second example, readiness to implement a program. So to assess the readiness, your rating scale, you'd want that to reflect the level of preparedness. And so you might choose a simple 3-point scale, such as fully prepared, partly prepared, and not at all prepared. So when they're using that map then in assessment mode, any node that is rated partly or not at all prepared would get added into the action plan, and the list of tasks that would be included for that node in the action plan would be those things required to change the rating to fully prepared. Let's now look at the third one there, tracking implementation in real time. You would use a similar approach for that. But for this application, your rating scale would reflect a level of completion. So you might, for example, use a 3-point scale again, completed, partly completed, and not started. In the Basemap builder, you could pre-populate the suggested action plan tasks with all of the tasks that are required to complete implementation for each node. So when you set up an assessment, I'll just set this video running. When you set up an assessment with the Basemap, you would start by rating every node as not started and add each node into your action plan into the to-do column. At the start of each week, you'd move selected cards into the in progress column as you get underway with those tasks. And at the end of the week, you would tick off any completed tasks. And then when all tasks for a node are completed, you would move the card into the done column. You then go back into the map and change the completion status on the node to completed. And when you close the node and go back into the map view, you can see that this will change the map icon to a purple tick. So in this way, your action plan is serving as your weekly work plan, while the assessment view of the map is showing your overall progress. Now, one of our clients actually came up with a really neat way of using Meerkat to track program implementation, which is the fifth example that I have of how you can use your interactive logic model. So what this client does is they set up an assessment with their Basemap on day 1, and then the members of the team use the map as a repository of information about what they did in relation to each node for each week over the next 6 months. So team members use the comments field to write up their activities each week, and they use the attach documents function to store documents relevant to their work over that period. Now, at the end of 6 months, the team then works their way through each node, reviewing the comments and the stored documents, and then they use a rating scale that reflects progress over the period. They then use the action plan to address any gaps or issues that they identify in their retrospective assessment of the previous 6 months worth of activity, and that action plan then forms the basis of their work plan for the next 6 months of activity. So in summary, today I've shown you how the ability to create interactive versions of your program logic models allows you to extend the usefulness of those models into a range of applications right across the lifespan of a program. So you can use the logic model to assess the readiness of a site to implement a particular program. You can then track the implementation of the program in real time. You can create a repository of program implementation information as the program is being rolled out. You can conduct formative evaluations and use the outcomes to drive further improvement in program implementation. You can conduct summative evaluations, and finally, you can compare program implementation across different sites. And of course, by using your logic model to provide the framework for these various monitoring and evaluation applications, you're actually testing the assumptions on which your logic model is based, and this provides an evidence base to support refinement of your program logic model if that turns out to be necessary. It's also worth noting, although I have not discussed it at all today, that an interactive logic map can also be used, for example, as a tool in implementing a standard or framework, and the Bpcle Framework implementation project was an example of that. And you can also use interactive logic maps for ongoing quality improvement for your business processes. Anyway, look, I've given you quite a lot of information today, and to help you remember what I've been talking about, shortly I will upload a file, a handout, which you are welcome to download from your screen when that appears. It's called Bright Ideas for Using Meerkat, and it provides a little bit of a summary of what I've spoken about today. So look, finally, I'd be interested, we've got one last poll here, and I'd be interested to know back from you whether any of the applications that I've talked about today would be of interest to you. So when Phil launches that, if you wouldn't mind completing the poll that's appearing on your screen. Yeah. So if you could just tell us if any of those interactive logic map applications would be of interest to you. Oh, great. Looks like, yeah, you can tick more than one of them, by the way. So, oh, that's great. Yeah, that's terrific. So that's looking like most of you would be interested in using for formative and summative evaluation. A little over half is a repository for program implementation information. Yeah, and then, oh, actually, everybody has some interest in all of those things, so that's really fantastic. Yeah, go ahead and tick as many of those as you're interested in. You don't have to just pick one. We certainly use it for lots of different things. Fantastic. Oh, great. That's really good to know. That's really good feedback. Well, that's really excellent.
Close that poll.
Yeah. So let me just relaunch the slides.
Hello, I'm back.
Phil's back. So so yeah. Look, I'm going to stop there and take any questions that you might have.
So just before we take any questions, I'm just checking, is everyone, if they're working, anyone's raised their hand?
Yes, you can raise your hand to ask a question, or you can type a question.
We have one, Peter. I'm going to unmute Peter.
Oh, can I hear the question as well?
Donna needs a slide.
Sorry.
Peter, can you go ahead? And people should be able to hear this question as well.
Yep. Can you hear me, Phil?
Yes. Go ahead.
My question is, suppose I wanted to add indicators to my model. How would I do that?
Yeah, look, that's actually a really good question. Thank you very much for that, Peter. So at the moment, we don't have the ability for you to mark a node with an indicator. We're working on that functionality at the moment. But what you have a couple of options that you can use for that. One option is to create a node category in your Basemap, which you might say put a red edge on and call that category indicator, and you can then position an indicator node next to, in its appropriate position on your logic map. The other way that you can incorporate indicators is when you're creating your Basemap. In the node description section, as well as including a rating question, you can also mark there an indicator that goes with that particular node. And then when you're using it in assessment mode, you'll see in the node description that there is an indicator that goes with that node. And you could use either the comments field or the documents upload to actually store indicator data that is relevant to that particular indicator. Yeah, thanks for that question. It's a good question.
Sounds
I'll
great.
just mute you again there, Peter. We've had a type question received from Robin, Donna, and Robin's asking whether you can export the Basemap content from Meerkat to use in other applications.
Yeah, so the short answer is yes, you can export the content. So once you have created the Basemap, you are able to, there's a download feature that you can do, and that gives you basically a file that you can open in Excel, which has all of the content that is in your map. So you can actually download everything that you have put into the system. You can download it again. We don't yet have any APIs built that allow you to, directly export from Meerkat into, say, DoView or anything like that. But that, quite honestly, it's because actually you can do more in Meerkat than you can in DoView. So I would think that that's not going to be something that a lot of people will want to do. But if our clients came to us and said, look, we really would like to be able to export this to use in this other program, then that is certainly something that we would look at. But we just haven't actually had any demand for that at the present time. But just to reiterate, you can download all of the backend content to an Excel file. Of course, you can create, a printable PDF of your map as well. So yes, in that regard, yes, you can download your map content.
Great, thanks, Robin. Good question. Now we have one from Bill, and he's asked, how might this work if your PLM is complex? For example, if your logic is cyclic and has different kinds of feedback loops.
Okay, well, Bill, that's actually quite a good question. So we tend to just show the relationships on our logic maps, and sometimes I think I've been criticized for having a lot of arrows going a lot of places, but we just actually tend to show those. Just by using arrowed lines and using pivot points to, to show how a connection feeds back from, this point feeds back to somewhere earlier in the logic map. One idea that we have for the future, although we haven't yet developed this, is the idea of nested maps, which would allow you to, if you had one map that, or one node that actually was a process that you wanted to expand into another map, that by clicking on an aspect of the node, it could take you into effectively the sort of nested map that sits behind that. We haven't developed that functionality at the moment. Again, no one's actually asked for it. That's just an idea in our heads. But if you do have that kind of level of complexity where you want to sort of drill down behind a node to get to something else, I would suggest creating a second base map that represents the more detailed view of what sits behind a node, and then in the node at the high level map, just indicating, see base map XYZ for greater detail about this particular aspect of this node. But to go back to what I think was your original question, Bill, if you just simply want to show that there are feedback loops, I would just simply use arrowed lines with pivot points in them to do that.
Okay, thanks, Donna. We have a question from Sarah, and she said, once I've created a base map and published it in Meerkat, can I edit it, or does publishing it make it uneditable? Is it fixed?
Oh yeah, no, you're most definitely not. So what happens is that when you publish a base map in Meerkat, all that really means is that it can now be accessed by the assessment function in Meerkat. So while they're in draft, you can't actually access them. But publishing it doesn't prevent you from editing it. All that happens is that you get a lovely little warning. The app says to you, are you sure you want to edit this? This map has already been published. So the short answer is yes, you can edit your maps once you have created them. But it is important to note that if you are changing a map that you have already used in an assessment, that will impact on, you just need to be aware that that can impact on that assessment. So what we usually recommend is that if you really want to significantly edit a map that you've already used in assessments, don't touch the original map, just clone it and then edit the clone of that map. Yep.
All right, look, I'm just conscious of time. I think we're coming to the end, and we don't have any more questions, no hands going up. So we might actually draw things to a conclusion. So just before bringing it to a close, Donna, I think, has got a announcement about a special subscription offer we're offering to people who participated today.
Yeah, so thanks very much, Phil. So basically, as part of this webinar, we are offering a 6-month subscription, 6 months that is, for $99 to people who have registered and attended today's webinar. That offer is only available for the next week, so to close the business on the 8th of August. It will give you 6 months of using Meerkat at a significantly discounted rate. Now, if you are interested in taking up that offer, there's going to be a feedback survey that appears on your screen when we end the webinar, and you can indicate your interest. I think it's in the last survey question that actually asks you if you're interested in this, and if you are, you can just tick that button and then provide your contact details, and we'll be in touch with you to arrange your account. If you accidentally close your browser window before you complete that survey, don't worry, because part of the webinar program is you'll be sent a follow-up email, and there'll be a link to the survey, to that same survey then, and so you can always complete it then, or you can always just contact us by the way, and we'd be happy to talk to you about your needs.
Okay, thanks, Donna. Look, I'd like to thank everyone for attending today. I hope you found today's presentation interesting, and it's given you some good ideas for the different ways in which you can use your program logic models. As Donna said, if you're interested in discussing any of these ideas further, just contact us and request a free online consultation. And again, you can provide your details in the feedback survey if you'd like any more information. So look, thanks everyone, and we'll be doing a second webinar in the coming months focusing on quality improvement, and we hope that you're able to join us again for that webinar. So good morning, everyone.
Thanks, bye-bye.